Hello and welcome to episode 131 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me to my left, about 30 degrees directly in
3.5 feet
line of sight, I can smell him, and he smells good. It's the one and only Shane Peeps.
I smell like green chili sauce. No, it's good to see you, Stanislav. It's weird. We're making direct eye contact. Like, they're just like looking at each other now.
Very uncomfortable.
Now it's extremely uncomfortable for me to sit across the table and see you two staring at each other with such admiration, mutual admiration and respect.
That's right. So we are in the Godfather Dave Harberger's basement.
Yeah.
In beautiful, chilly Chicago, Illinois.
Chilly. It's 90 degrees outside, but it is 60 degrees in my basement, apparently.
Yeah, we should take a picture of your thermostat just to prove to the world that your basement is freezing.
It's brisk. I rolled in about 3:30 this afternoon. My wife and I got in from the outskirts of Chicago. Stan came over. We riled up Dave's children, and then we had tacos. And yeah, now we're recording a podcast.
Pretty good tacos.
Yeah, they were good.
Yeah, today I learned that Dave just feeds his kids pure maple syrup for dinner.
That's it.
Just
when you want it
handfuls
to
of
be
it.
good, it's just maple syrup, pancakes, and eggs, and that's all they get. Breakfast for dinner. Dad was by himself.
That is tasty. On this week's episode, we spend even more time exploring the ins and outs of Modern and the ongoing impact of Modern Horizons 2 on the format. There's just so many decks to play, and frankly, I think we want to try them all. So we'll kick off with a look at the MOCS Modern results, along with several other tournaments that happened this past weekend. Then follow up with our experience trying out more emerging top decks from recent competitive environments, including things like Rakdos Lurrus, Hammertime, Enchantress, maybe more.
You left out the amount of time that we're just going to spend weeping on air, since this is the first time that we've seen Shane in person since December of 2019.
Yeah. And then
From the live episode at Mystery Street?
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
That was the last time I think I saw him in person.
No.
Yeah.
No, that was like a year after that, right?
No.
Are you kidding me?
It was not.
Oh my God.
I think it was.
Wow. I really thought that was like the year before.
We didn't have a podcast. We were on episode 3 a year before.
Oh my gosh,
we weren't
you're
trying
right.
to do.
Like time is devious at this point.
Now he is getting choked up now that he's really thinking about the enormity of it.
Fireworks.
Yes, there are fireworks in Chicago.
Everyone on Nextdoor right now is posting, is that gunshots? But Stan and I are going to be playing in the background as Dave goes through his deck dive. So if you hear the sound of flicking, that's just me kibbling it over here.
Dave, should we be recording in person more often? This is kind of nice.
It's nice to be able to see you in person. I think maybe we could. Cool? Shane might feel a little left out if we do that.
Our editor is going to be like, please no, this is going to be an audio disaster, I'm sure, but it's worth it for the lulls.
We'll try. Before the whole episode really starts, we should get through some housekeeping.
Yeah.
Shout out to the newest patron to join the Dive Down Nation, Steve Bo Bevo. Thank you very much for your support. Also, big thanks to Young Lewin from Germany for leaving a very kind review on Apple Podcasts.
Yep, Patreon. Patreon's good. Let's talk about Patreon for a second. I feel like we haven't gone in.
Do you want to get the weeping in now? Because
it's just
you're off the track for a minute.
Let's save it for the wind down.
That's how we wind down around this place. You guys saw my kids. They do wind down by crying.
Yeah, Patreon. I feel like we haven't gone over some of the good deeds of Patreon recently. One of the most important things is we do early content for folks at the $5 and above tiers. CEO Bob had a special request for the recorded video. We stream this every Sunday night is when we typically record.
We mostly stream it. We're not streaming tonight.
Oh yeah, we're not streaming tonight because it's way too hard to do this in the same room. It wouldn't make much sense. But anyway, yeah, if you want to we post that the day after on YouTube. Almost always, we post the episode as soon as we get it from our editor up on the Patreon, usually maybe a half day or a full day before it goes live to the nation.
Yeah, our live video, it's kind of like the Graham Norton show because we got like a cast of couch full of celebrities from America and the UK, and it's like Jude Law telling stories about playing Magic that you only get if you're a patron.
Yeah, it's top secret. But there's also, of course, the swag, the awesome playmat that goes out, the pins and stickers and custom tokens and things like that. So if you have not already, if you want to support us, if you want to keep us going, head on over to patreon.com/thedivedown. Most importantly, even just $1 an episode, you get into our awesome super secret Slack server, the awesome Dive Down Nation, the only place that I want to talk about Magic and the only place I do talk about Magic with all my buds there. So head on over to Patreon and help us out if you want. And if not, support somebody else.
And finally, the Dive Down is brought to you in part by manatraders.com, the best rental service on Magic Online, we believe. Modern Horizons 2. It's hot. What can you say? It's hot, everybody. But I rented the decks that I played this week from them. Shane and Stan did as well. And if you want to sign up, check out manatraders.com. Put in code the Dive Down, all one word, lowercase.
Dave, you got the code wrong.
I got the code wrong? I did get the code wrong.
It's the Dive Down 2021. Listeners, delete what you just put into the little coupon code box. It's the Dive Down 2021.
Yeah, we forgot they updated it. So the Dive Down 2021 to get 15% off your first 2 months of a subscription rental service. Manatraders.com. Thank you so much. I got to pull it together. I'm messing up. We're here in person. I'm staring at Stan when he's trying to give me hand signals. I don't even know. I don't know.
It's real weird.
I'm used to you guys being talking heads in a box.
I think we could get used to this, though.
I mean, yeah, now once we move to our palatial new compound where we're going to be just generating content 24/7, y'all.
I know. Can that be a new stretch goal on Patreon where we all move to Door County?
Yeah, I love Door County. It would probably be pretty cold in the winter, but that's a good time to generate a lot of content.
It's true.
Sure, we'll put out a stretch goal of, I don't know.
10K?
I think $20,000 an
20K?
episode. We get to 20K an episode. You will move in together with our wives into a compound, into kind of like an ashram thing.
Yes.
And we'll create content for you all the time.
A cabal.
I don't overpromise, but
we'll call it the cabal.
Yeah.
The Dorco cabal.
Yeah, I like it.
All right, with all that out of the way, though, Shane, I would say that you're at the news desk, but we're sitting at the same table.
Yeah. I'm at the content table.
It's the north side of the table.
Just to be clear, at the compound, it's going to be a lot cooler than a content table. It's going to be more like a content lab or something like that.
A lab. Makerspace. So, I've got the breakdown this week. And so what we're going to do here is let's try to pull this together a little bit. I'm going to talk about a few modern events, and they're interesting. They happen at very similar but different and nuanced ways of playing modern Magic online right now. We had the MOCS Season 1 inaugural Champions Showcase. We had an Insight Modern 5K. So Insight Esports had one of their sort of premier level events on through MTG Melee. Then we had 2 Modern Challenges as well this weekend. So we had a few different tiers and a few different levels of play that I think all will continue to solidify and give us a view into the emerging and ever-changing Modern Horizons 2 modern metagame. Say that 3 times fast, along with a Erasno Mandicular Calendar.
Asmore, Enamar, Decay, Dacenac, Uldakar.
Thank you, Stan. So let's start with the MOCS Season 1. And so what exactly is this Champions Showcase? Basically, it's a 70K prize pool. That's maybe that's almost as much as the what Worlds is this year. That's a different podcast altogether. 70K prize pool, 20K to the winner. People in this event, and there's 8 people, okay? So people were absolutely testing and bringing what they thought was the best deck for the weekend. And these 8 competitors were from a variety of qualifying events and different formats from Season 1 of 2021 Magic Online Premier Play.
Yeah, one thing to point out is that these small player pool metagames can be pretty weird, especially since a lot of these players know each other by name or by reputation. And so there might be some kind of next level metagaming going on where people are expecting one person to bring a certain type of deck because they are known for being a certain type of player. I don't recognize these people's names as much, but for sure, if these people are all grinders, they know each other pretty well.
Yeah.
And so, there's probably some of that going on. So the really interesting thing here, let's go through the top 8 really quick. I'll read out what the decks were. So we had Ryan Haddad, Slasher21 on Is It Blitz with DRC, as you guys talked about last week. A lot of the decks are running Dragon's Rage Channeler now.
Basically, instead of Sprite Dragon.
That's right. Yeah. Yep. And Bauble over Opt is kind of like where the whole thing is at. Yuki Ichikawa, Triosk on Teamer Footfalls. We had Max Mick on 4-color Footfalls. We had Dominic Prozak on Is It Blitz, Francisco Sanchez on Mardu Shadow, Nathan Stoyer on 4-color Footfalls, Max Revort on Is It Blitz, and finally Fiona Way on Rakdos, Aggro, Mid, Rock, whatever we're calling that deck.
Yeah, and so it's interesting, I think, to point out perhaps that Fiona Way came in as the modern champion for this MOCS. So like everyone came in sort of as the legacy or the limited or the standard, or there was a couple like open slots. So Fiona, maybe they are a modern specialist, but that's how they came in into this championship. And yeah, so this is not a huge metagame. And there's only 8 players, but we're only seeing 3 decks here, right?
2 Rakdos, one of them was Shadow, one was not Shadow, 3 Is It Blitz, and 3 Footfalls decks of different kinds, Cascade Footfalls decks.
Yeah. No copies of Urza Saga here
Shocking.
at all. Yeah. I mean, so like Dave said, I think there's an interesting discussion that is probably more nuanced than we need to have for this podcast because we have a lot of other content to cover. But there's a certain thing that, if everyone knows Urza Saga is really powerful, then playing it maybe exposes you to being hated out by artifact or enchantment hate. I mean, I've certainly been seeing a lot of it in the leagues and things like that. Maybe they discovered that it wasn't the way they thought they were going to win this tournament. It wasn't the highest raw power level that they wanted to bring. And so I think that that's something that you can look at these decks and say, is this just the way that a pro wants to win, or do they think they had an edge in the very small player pool here?
One thing I think is interesting is that it doesn't seem like these particular decks have any hate cards that are directly pointed at Urza's Saga.
No.
Well, I mean, we're looking at copies here of Endurance, Force of Vigor.
Yeah, 3 Force of Vigor is definitely something that...
What else are they really targeting?
Yeah, I don't want to see that. 3 Blood Moon. I mean, there's definitely some. There's 4 Wear Tear, which is actually something that people have been talking a lot about. And let's see, 4 Wear Tear in the Max Mix 4-color Footfall deck, for instance. Like you said, Stan, 3 Force of Vigor, 4 Wear Tear. It's interesting that maybe, like you said, Stan, is like there we saw some of these cards out there, so maybe people were just being like, I don't want to get Shattering Speed. I don't want to have, destroy target artifact. I got Shattering Speed 3 times in a league recently, and I was like, well, that card is certainly not great against the deck I played.
I was playing 4 of them in the deck that I was playing this week. There are 4 in the sideboard.
So what I think is interesting is the amount of Teamer Footfalls, or just Footfalls deck we saw in general, because... Yes. But it doesn't really surprise me because of the players we had here. Like, this is essentially a control combo deck. Like, if you consider casting a single card a combo. So it's a lot of interaction to stop what the other person is doing and then really easily getting a couple 4/4 rhinos down. So it's kind of like a control combo tempo-ish style deck, just getting enough clarity on the battlefield to keep getting your rhinos through. And I think that's the kind of deck that great players might gravitate towards, where like I can stop what my opponent is doing and then just have the battlefield clear for my rhinos and win the game. I have a little bit of a hard time thinking this is the best deck, like just in a vacuum, but I do think control decks seemingly always do better in the hands of players that are better than I am.
The other thing is that you can just get pretty aggro with this deck too and just play Crashing Footfalls on turn 1 and then just kind of hold the ground.
This deck is also positioned to cascade into Footfalls on turn 2 if you're on the draw, because it runs 3 main deck Gemstone Caverns. So you can get that out pretty early. I think this is a little bit more of a mid-range deck than a tempo deck, because you're not really getting any threats down early. Your only threats are Rhinos or Charlotte's Agent.
Let's get into a very long discussion about tempo that we'll have off mic after this episode's done recording.
Oh, I've been waiting for years.
Oh, no.
But yeah, I think
this event, by the way,
it was Yuchi Ichikawa, who is 2 proto top 8s. They have 9 GP top 8s. They've won 4 GPs. They know what they're doing, and I think they were the favorite going in. No offense to the other players here, but I think Yuki just has the biggest resume. Yeah,
and Yuki, as a reminder, was on Teamer Footfalls, so the most kind of like normal, basic version of that build, the most common build, I guess.
I think we should also take note of not only the fact that Yuki won this tournament with Team of Footfalls, but the amount of footfalls in this event compared to everything else we're about to talk about. Because it feels like this was almost Footfall's last hurrah, and I almost wonder if they registered these decks a week ago.
Yeah, I really wish I could have found the cutoff. I couldn't find it easily when I was doing these notes, but I thought the same thing. I was like, I wonder when the cutoff was, because like if it was open deck lists, and I mean, that's the kind of thing that changes the way you play, not the way you register. But anyway, let's head into this Insight Modern 5K, which is a very different tier of play altogether. It's a 5K. It has a 25 plus 250 entry fee, and so that's not too bad. But it is it's a serious entry fee and you have to put aside a bunch of time to play in the Swiss and then in the top 8 if you make it. So,
hey, before you get into this, people, please play these tournaments.
Yeah,
please play these Insight tournaments, because I can't play these Insight tournaments, and I feel like they're out there doing the work right now. They keep putting up these 5Ks, and I know that they're not meeting their registration to make the 5K pay back out quite yet. So let's try to help them.
Right on.
Play these tournaments. I think they're good. They're fun. There's a lot of good players in them.
Yeah, I mean, Gabe Nassif was in the top 8, and a little bit of a spoiler, playing Living End. So he thinks it's legit. So yeah, there were 78 players in this, which does not make a 5K entry pool, but they paid it out, I think. So yeah, like Dave said, absurd EV. Somehow people must not have heard about this event, or maybe they were all playing in something else, because yeah, this is a high profile event. Good payout. Let's want to first talk about the metagame that we saw. What do we see?
Number 1, with 14% of the field, was Is It Blitz?
Yeah, I do think that Goldfish is kind of lumping in some Is It Delvery style decks in with Blitz, where it's not pure Blitz. Like I think some of these actually do have like Counterspell in them, but I think that overall the biggest share of the metagame was Is It aggressive tempo-y style decks.
Yep, and then we had Other with 12.82%, 10 decks, and Black Red with 11.5% of the metagame and 9 decks.
Breakout weekend for Black Red.
Big time.
Also known as Rakdos.
We'll come back to it, but it was everywhere.
Everywhere, and quite successful. After Black Red, with just under 9%, it was Amulet Titan, 7 copies.
And then Urza's Kitchen followed that with 5 copies. Those are your Urza Saga decks, as we talked about, that were definitely missing from the MOCS. They're here. They're in positions 4 and 5.
Yeah, I mean, it's Urza Saga and Asmore Food.
Right. Yeah, Asmore Food.
And Titan's an Urza Saga deck.
That's what I mean. Yeah, it's those 2 decks together are kind of your Saga decks right now. So there were a lot of decks playing that.
And there's like a weird array of like Jeskai Stoneforge style decks, 4-color Death Shadow. I think some Velomachus type stuff is in that like Wurg, pile, Enchantress. So a lot of like 2-ofs and things like that don't really hold a candle to the metagame share of kind of the big names that we have been talking about, and then the emergence this weekend of Rakdos decks, I think.
That's right. All right, do we want to talk about win rates in the Swiss, or do we want to talk about the top 8?
Yeah, let's talk about win rates in the Swiss, because I do think they were pretty wild. You'd think that with the metagame share so high that you might have seen like also a pretty good win rate to go along with some of these decks, but we really did not. I'm going to start at the bottom. 36% for these various Is It aggro style decks. 36% win rate.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
My baby.
Sorry,
no.
Well, you have a new baby this weekend.
Let's find out.
In the Rakdos decks.
No spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers. So yeah, I won't even ask you a question about Is It versus the other style of decks. Going up from there.
I do think Is It has some problems right now. We'll talk about it, but...
Why wait?
We're
talking about his 36% win rate. What do you think might be the problem?
I just think that it's adapted to being a Dragon's Rage Channeler deck, and there's just other decks that are better at being Dragon's Rage Channeler decks, maybe. And also, there's been a lot of talk in the Slack from Abe and a couple other people of our kind of Slack regulars about if Is It is trying to give up too much speed in order to play the grindy game via Channeler and Bauble and Delirium and stuff like that. I think maybe. I think another problem actually for the Is It decks is Unholy Heat. And there are a lot of decks playing that card, in particular the red-black deck, and that card just kills a Stormwing entity. And the Is It decks aren't running mutagenic growth at this point, really, or some of them aren't anymore as a counterspell against red direct damage, because it still dies if you mutagenic growth your Stormwing entity.
Yeah, so you can't prowess yourself out of it, is what you're saying.
It's a lot harder to do it, and mutagenic growth is less effective. You can generally just kill their Stormwing entity, and that's a big turning point for them. For one, they spend 2 spells and some stuff on it, and then you use 1 mana to get rid of it. Part of the reason that people were playing Stormwing entity is because it was protected from those things.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if they replaced the wrong card. Instead of taking out Stormwing, maybe they should take out...
Maybe instead of taking out Sprite Dragon, they should take out Stormwing.
Correct, yeah.
I mean, I thought about it a little bit when I was looking at the list, that maybe it's time to park Stormwing for a little bit. We'll just have to see. I mean, it's a powerful core of spells. It was like the preeminent deck before Modern Horizons 2. Maybe it'll find its way. But a lot of other decks got a lot of tools, and this deck didn't quite get the same type of tools. I mean, it did get good cards like Dragon's Rage Channeler and Unholy Heat itself.
Murktide Regent, maybe.
It's just a totally different deck then, though, right?
Sure.
Which is fine.
Yeah, that's like the Delver style decks, where it's playing maybe sometimes even literal Delver, not very frequently now, but it's saying like, hey, I'm going to hold up, instead of having a bunch of, this is like we talked about last week, Stan, where it's like the proactive versus reactive strategy, where it's like, I'm going to play all my spells on my turn to like burn you out, clear the board, get damage through, or I'm going to have a bunch of counter magic to protect my strategy and deal with things like maybe these Rakdos decks with the Thoughtseize and Inquisition and Fatal Pushes and things like that, where it's like, I'm going to keep my board and not just try to get damage through on turn 3.
Yeah. Don't you think, though, Lava Dart plus Murktide, there's a little sexy package there. An easy way to get extra counters on your Murktide Regent by flashbacking your Lava Darts?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
But it's all they're good cards. I just don't know how it's going to turn out to shake out. I mean, let's talk really quickly in this context of the top creatures played in this tournament.
Yeah.
Just really quickly, Dragon's Rage Channeler was 96 copies. It was in 31% of the decks. Ragavan was 68 copies and 23% of the decks. And formerly top creature that was in all the decks, Monastery Swiftspear, was only in 56 of the decks, 18%.
Well, it's 56 copies and 18% of the deck.
56 copies in 18% of the deck. So it took a hit. So I don't know what the best Monastery Swiftspear deck is right now, but maybe we'll see. This
is a dangerous looking, like, sort of top spells, top cards played. It's just red, artifact, red, red. Is it red, red? Is it /blue, artifact, red? Saying something about what we're seeing in the modern metagame right now.
The top 4 creatures are all red 1-drops.
Yeah, and the CMC of modern, as we have seen in other formats, just steadily creeping down to be hyper efficient right now. So either that means there's openings for people to take advantage of, or this is kind of just the evolution that we're seeing of modern with things like Modern Horizons 2. Anyway, side note, that was a big tangent off of Izzet's win percentage. So let's go. Yeah, 36% Izzet aggro style decks, 47% for Jeskai Stoneblade, a little bit below average, 48% for Titan decks. So even though they were very well represented, they still had a below 50% win rate. 53% for 4-color shadow strategies. There were 2 of those, and so yeah, I guess it's just you did a little bit better than average. The big thing I wanted to point out here is 59% for Rakdos, Lurrus style decks, and that's really good. 59% is a high win rate in the modern metagame, so people who chose these decks and played these decks had a good weekend. I'll say.
Question for you guys. Where did you find these win rates?
On MTG Melee's website.
Oh, cool. Because I'm looking at the tournament. I don't see the win rates by archetype.
Yeah, if you can like sort by things. That's one good thing I really do like about MTG Melee. Stan did not just tee that up because we have no affiliation with this website, but you can get onto the bottom. You can see the archetype breakdown. You can sort by match win percentage and record and things like that. Percentage of the field, number of decks. So it's a really good way to the issue that you will find is that the normalization of data is not perfect because frequently it is user submitted information. So in really big fields, it'll just be like combo or Jeskai or something like that. But here it seems like it's pretty well controlled, and we're able to actually sort of group decks together, and Goldfish did some work there too. So combining them both is a very powerful way to look at a tournament.
Yeah, so going to the top 8, speaking of red-black, there were 3 decks in the top 8 that were red-black. Jim Davis came in 8th, and then the final was a mirror match of Rakdos between Omar Lopez Cabrera and Matt Brown. Omar Lopez Cabrera, the winner of the tournament. These weren't identical 75 mirror matches, but they were close. They had a lot of the same cards, probably 70 of the same cards.
Weird.
Look at that.
Yeah, I feel like, Dave, I'm sure you're going to talk more about kind of the construction of these style of decks, but I've seen sort of very subtle distinctions between decks that seem a little bit more mid-range and decks that seem a little bit more aggressive. Yeah. So there's some that will have like Scourge is kind of like, I think maybe one of the big selections that you would make.
So there's a good amount of Mardu Shadow running around.
Sure.
Right now,
but even if it's not always in those, like sometimes you'll see like a Scourge in a non-shadow one.
Yeah, I think that the deck. So let's save it for when I dive deep into it. But I think that the creature package I think is pretty tight on these decks. It's more the spells and a couple of flex spots right now.
Okay.
But there's definitely enough shadow and enough red-black Lurrus that are both floating around that there's kind of this like archetype of Rakdos Lurrus stuff going on. The ones that had a big breakout this weekend were, I would say, are not the Shadow Mardu Shadow decks. It's more this different deck.
Very cool. Gabe Nassif on Living End had one of the best win rates of the Swiss.
Yeah, he went like 7-1 or 7-0, something like that.
I think 8-2 overall or 8-1 overall.
8-1 overall, yeah.
Yeah, so I think they lost in the top 8, right?
Yes. Came in third place.
The only copy of Living End in the field as well.
Yeah, I heard him talk about his playing experience with this on Midweek Metagame, which he's one of the hosts there, and I think he's just been saying like he's been liking it quite a bit and doesn't feel like it has a lot of predators out there, and I think it's the kind of game that players know when to pick their spots and trying to go off with a combo and what kind of pressure they can put on people to make it more advantageous, and sometimes it just can win. It's just it's a solid deck right now, I think, and I think you need to have a plan for it if you're playing on Magic Online right now.
I kind of feel like now is a great time for just more Rest in Peace or maybe additional copies of Leyline of the Void, because between red black, between any of some of the blue decks that are playing Dragon's Rage Channeler, Living End, I feel like the best way to deal with a lot of these decks is make sure they have no graveyard at all, rather than trying to do something like Rest in Peace or Tormod's Crypt.
See, that does kind of surprise me, is that I have felt that I've seen a lot of graveyard hate. Like I'm running in the deck that I played this week, I had a Tormod's Crypt and a few Relic, I think it was Relic, yeah, Relic, and then we're seeing lots, the continued use of Soul Guide Lantern. I'm surprised, like you said, Stan, is we aren't seeing a ton of Leyline, because I think maybe we have the density of artifact-based graveyard hate, where people are just like, hey, I'm not in a heavy black deck, so I'm going to be the person with the Soul Guide Lantern this week, or I'm going to have the thing I can tutor up, especially if you're playing an Urza Saga deck, right? Like I can get the Tormod's Crypt that I could just have pop into play and just pop right there type thing. Or you can use it on demand. So like they cast Living End with that on the stack, then you're good to go. It's not something they can counterspell at that point, even if they have some kind of counter.
True. And I think a lot of the decks that would be running Leyline of the Void would just rather play Lurrus. Yes. And that's where Soul Guide comes in handy, or Crypt for that matter.
Well, and I also wanted to say, I think that there are cards that are just better against Cascade as well. So you get a little bit, if you're worried about this deck in particular, you probably need to be worried about Cascade and Graveyard Hate, because you need to be worried about Team Footfalls decks as well. And also maybe the weird Warp World or Glimpse of Tomorrow deck or whatever that deck is called too. Like all those decks that are trying to use Shardless Agent to combo into things. And there's cards that are better there, right?
Well, Footfalls and Living End are very different decks. Footfalls doesn't care about the graveyard.
Right, but they both care about Cascade.
That's true.
And so I think you need to think about that axis too. That can be pretty good against Living End as well. And so what you're thinking about there sometimes is like Chalice of the Void and Void Mirror as well are actually cards that are pretty good in that kind of matchup. And so there was one deck running those this week, and we can talk about it.
God, this is the most teases per minute that we've ever clocked.
TPM is pretty high.
Yeah.
I do quickly want to get into these modern challenges. I'm not going to go into any top 8s of any of them or anything like that, but it was one on the 27th and one on the 28th. And actually, the 26th and the 27th. And I just went through the top 16. I cataloged what made the top 16 in both of these tournaments, and what I saw was 5 each of Amulet Titan and Rakdos aggro / mid-range style decks. So that was 10 of our 32 decks. There was 3 Dimir Food. There were 2 each of Hammertime, Is It Blitz, Is It Delver, and Eldrazi sticking around. That's our Chalice of the Void / maybe probably not Voidmere style deck though. And then one was a bunch of stuff. You had elementals and scales and Living End and Yawgmoth, Enchantress, various blade decks, and so on. So we really are seeing a little bit of a concentration in both the Insight Esports and in the challenges of a lot of Amulet Titan, a lot of Rakdos decks, still seeing some food stick around in these challenges. And then if you totaled Blitz and Delver style decks together, they do play different, in my opinion. We would have 4 Is It decks there as well. And so I think that's what seems to be emerging as the deck of choice for people. What are we thinking overall? Like, we talked about a bunch of different tournaments. We talked about a good amount of different decks. What are we seeing? What are we not seeing? What seems like it's fading away? What seems like it's rising?
I mean, number one for me was just I expected to see a lot more food given the talk last week. I mean, I kind of had to dip out for a little bit because of work and other stuff, and I wasn't really getting to play. But every piece of content I was consuming was like the food decks, the food decks, the food decks, the food decks. And, I've been playing the last 5 or 6 days and have not seen a lot of those, and they're not showing up in huge numbers here either. So that was a surprise to me. What about you, Stan?
Just the consolidation around Dragon's Rage Channeler and also to a certain extent the Monkey Ragavan. It seems like red is really starting to emerge as kind of the best way to be proactive.
Yeah.
And that's, so often the modern format is just about who can have the most proactive strategy that can be disruptive while staying aggressive. And I think we're seeing just a lot of that in different DRC or Ragavan packages, if not both.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Stan, what's interesting is when you said that, I was instantly thinking about the whole modern metagame right now. Like, lots of almost every deck, except for perhaps like Amulet Titan, really seems to derive its power from having disruption plus aggression, or a plan at least, right? Like, it's just like I can mess with what you're doing because I either have free spells or cheap spells, or we have 1 mana removal that red now has 1 mana removal that can deal 6 damage.
It can kill a Primeval Titan.
We have a great efficiency of spells that can be disruptive, be aggressive. They can mess with what the opponent's game plan is. They can counter a spell for free. They can counter a creature or planeswalker for free. They can Swords to Plowshares for free. So we have this interesting ability of modern decks to not lean on a single game plan. Like the control deck of yore with a Celestial Colonnade as your finisher on turn 17 is just like, what would you even do that for? Like, I can have an aggressive game plan with counter magic backup that doesn't require me to lock the game up in the same way at all. Mm-hmm. And so, like, you're saying like I'm able to apply pressure while also having reactive spells, and I think that is a big shift in the modern metagame, because it's not just a small selection of decks that's doing that. It's, I'd say, 2/3 of the deck that we're seeing continue to do well. And I think we'll talk about that as we go through the rest of this episode as well, because I think that a few of us played decks like that. I would describe as that, at least.
Yep.
You guys remember Grief plus Ephemerate?
I haven't seen it once.
Same.
I haven't had Solitude cast against me once. There's a whole bunch of things that I've barely seen, like Stoneforge. I did last week when I was playing more Rakdos Shadow, kind of Mardu Shadow. I did see a bunch of Stoneforge decks then. Culture Complete, but it's weird. I haven't seen some of those decks that I thought were really going to be there. It's really just like you said. Everybody's trying to figure out what the best Dragon's Rage Channeler shell is right now.
Yeah, it's a bit scary. I did have I was Solitude ephemerated, and it was upsetting in one of my leagues this week. So, but yeah, that did feel like an outlier, right? Like, it's not like I'm having that happen to me often. Decks are using the elementals, I think, in interesting and different ways than I expected. And I think I'll talk about that maybe if I've got time during my league experience, because I wanted to call out some of the opponents' decks that I thought were interesting. But yeah, I think that's interesting. Like you said, Dave, is the lack of food, or sort of like the diminishing metagame share of food is surprising to me, because like you said, I think it might be sort of maybe a conversation vacuum, because food's so new and it so reminds us of perhaps of the Urza decks of yore, right? Where it's like, there's Urza and there's artifacts and there's Urza Saga, and these are a new powerful way of attacking. And Asmo just invalidates creature decks, and then we see black red and Izzet decks just take over the weekend.
I don't think any of us in this room, by the way, we're all in the same room right now.
Oh, crazy.
That's still cool. Still
feeling awkward, but
obviously we don't think that these Asmar food decks are dead or up from the format. I think what we might be experiencing is this race to the bottom to figure out the best aggressive red shell, because that's probably where the most powerful creatures are right now. And then once we have a little bit of more of a solved metagame there around whether it's Ragavan or Dragon Rage, maybe we'll start to see different mid-range or controlling shells kind of emerge that can keep up. Because I do think Jeskai Monkey Blade still does keep up, and we have, it's still doing well all over the place, and it may be kind of the best control deck this week.
Yeah, it's interesting. It didn't show up in any of these top 8s, I don't think, or at least not in significant numbers. We might have had one, but the kind of protect the best creature strategies seem to be more like a couple of shadow decks that snuck through more so than that.
Yeah, it wasn't in the events we talked about, but it was in the challenges.
Okay.
Jeskai won, I think, the Saturday challenge, or came in second in the Sunday challenge.
Got it. I mean, it's a good card. You guys talked about it a little bit last week, I think, where there has been a little bit of a renaissance with Stoneforge just in general, and that's a cool place to be.
Love her.
All right, so we've had some fun talking about tournaments. Are we ready to talk about our experiences league-in?
Yeah, let's take the proverbial quick break. Let's head out of this section and then come back in so Dave can school us on the new good decks from Modern Horizons 2. So stay with us.
And we're back. Before we dive into these decks that we've been playing,
we'll admit failure.
Well, let's just acknowledge you might be hearing background noise.
You might be hearing echo. You might be hearing crosstalk.
There may be a little bit of that, but also people shooting fireworks outside of Dave's house to celebrate Dave. There's some airplanes. There's some cars honking their horns. Our wives are upstairs talking.
This is a direct-to-disc, studio to master disc recording.
This is what it'll sound like if and when we finally get to record at parties and we just do live shows to empty rooms.
I'm sure people can't wait for GPs to happen again so that they can see us live on tour.
Yeah, awkwardly talking about Modern Magic and being like, "Where's our editor, Tanner?"
They get a whole 30 people.
Yeah, we'll just do some improv games.
Yeah, I love that. 5 things, go.
Okay, Dave, what I'd like for you to do actually live is finally, come through with all these content hints you've been getting and talk to us about Rakdos in Modern Magic.
Yeah. So I somehow I ended up playing the deck of the weekend, I think, randomly.
Yeah.
Now, we all know who designed this deck, right?
We do. Friend of the show.
It was
Ever
me.
Mohan.
No, it was me.
Friend of the show, Dave Harburger.
Yeah. No, of course it was Ever Mohan, Aspiring Spike, who I first noticed this deck because I saw him tweeting on Thursday about how he had gone 10-0 with this deck. And then later on, he reported that he got another trophy, had won 15 matches in a row, and ended up 44-6 with the deck overall. I guess across 10 leagues, he went 44-6 is what that would break down to.
So the equivalent of 1 month of Magic for me, he's just sort of casually busting out 10 leagues.
Yeah, exactly. And 4, by my count, that means 4 of them were trophies, by the way, at least. So, I mean, I was on vacation. I was looking for something fun to play. I had already spent some time playing some Dragon's Rage Channeler, Ragavan, Douthie Voidwalker decks in Shadow the weekend before, where I was playing some Mardu Shadow decks I didn't get to talk to you guys about on the podcast. So I thought that those cards already together were really strong, and I saw this deck and I was like, wow, it's just a lot easier to not have to worry about mind games with Death Shadow or anything like that. Like, let's just play awesome threats and kind of see where it goes from there. So you kind of hinted at it, Stan. I think that this is a red-black disruptive deck that is just short of mid-range. It's really...
too fast to be mid-range.
It kind of is too fast to be mid-range, and it's also just, it's so low to the ground. Like, it's focused on getting Delirium to power up a couple of your cards. It's really heavy on discard. So you can cast spells proactively to be able to get, like, a sorcery into the graveyard. Basically, had a good amount of removal, kind of what you would expect from a fast aggro deck that's a little bit interactive. It's not quite the same type of thing. It's never going to be as fast as, like, Izzet or something like that. So it's definitely slots in between a true mid-range deck and something that's just all aggro, like a Burn or Prowess style, something like that.
Dave, I'm also very excited to hear if your discard spells enabled you putting things into the graveyard of your opponents to cast back with Dauthi Voidwalker.
Yes.
So that's me just crossing my fingers.
All the time. So it features a bunch of Modern Horizons 2 cards. I think it's kind of an uncomfortable level of Modern Horizons 2 cards in this deck, because let me read the deck list to you. In the creature suite, we have 4 Dragon's Rage Channeler, 4 Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, 4 Dauthi Voidwalker, and the list that I played, it was tweaked out by a lot of people later, was I had 3 Turok Dread Cantor in my decks, and then I also had 3 Unholy Heat main and 1 in the sideboard. So fully 23 cards in the 75 at least were Modern Horizons 2 cards, plus I had a couple of copies of Void Mirror.
We haven't really talked about anyone playing with Turok here. Whether you do it now or later, I'd love to hear what you thought about that card.
I'll definitely spend some time on it because I think it's an interesting one. But the big thing here is that it's all the good cheap creatures from Modern Horizons 2. It's a bunch of the cards that we thought were going to be good together in one spot. Also, since this is a Delirium style deck, you want to enable an Unholy Heat and Dragon's Rage Channeler as fast as possible. Bauble makes an appearance, and when Bauble comes along, since the casting cost is right, of course, this is a Lurrus deck. It's what, Everett has long said he thought was kind of like the best thing to be doing in Modern is some kind of Lurrus deck. This is a really good Lurrus deck. But, there's also, I think that the last card in the creature suite is worth talking about too, because this is one of the first decks that I played, honestly, one of the first decks that I played where I was like, Kroxa is amazing.
Wow.
Kroxa is so good in this deck. It's crazy good in this deck, I think.
Because it helps enable your Dauthi stuff.
Not even Dauthi is important. You just demolish people's hands in this deck. You demolish them. You have, I had some notes on this a little bit later. You have 15 of the spells in your deck make opponents discard cards. And then another 8 of them lets you steal cards from your opponent's deck one way or another, whether that's Dauthi Voidwalker or your Ragavan. 15 spells. There's,
it's like a freaking nightmare to play against.
There's 4 Inquisition of Kozilek. There's 3 Thoughtseize. The deck I had 2 Kolaghan's Command. Most people I saw over the weekend had swapped that over to being 3 Kolaghan's Command and having 1 less Turok, basically, or 1 less
K-Com is back.
Yeah, it was really good in it. And then, of course, you have 3 Kroxa, and that's just... And then whatever number of Turok you had to all kind of play into a discard theme. This is one of the first decks in a while where I really felt like I was just like, I'm just going to take your hand apart and keep an eye on it and then stick a couple of threats, get some value off of my Dragon's Rage Channeler or sculpt the top of my deck and then just kind of like go. And hopefully I can protect stuff from there. As I mentioned, it's rounded out by the deck. Once you get to like you're done with your discard suite with Kroxa and Thoughtseize and Inquisition of Kozilek, you kind of round out the last bit of cards in the deck with Lightning Bolt and K-Command and your Unholy Heats that I mentioned before. And that's the deck. It's discard cards, it's Lightning Bolt / creature removal, it's Bauble, and it's an incredibly cheap creature package. That's all of it.
I don't know. I feel like this is a conversation we'll probably have later in terms of Mishra's Bauble. But this is just one of those decks that I feel like 3 months ago, they probably wouldn't be running Bauble just because the cards like Unholy Heat and cards like DRC and weren't really in the deck, so it wasn't relying on getting Delirium. But I feel like Mishra's Bauble is now fairly ubiquitous across so many different kinds of decks, just simply because of it makes you play essentially a 56-card deck and enables Delirium, but it's always done that. It's always enabled the 56-card deck, but it hasn't been quite as everywhere as we're seeing it now.
I don't think that's totally true. I mean, Bauble's been was in Rakdos Shadow for a while, and also I believe it was in Rakdos Prowess as well, because Rakdos Prowess was a Lurrus deck too, and so that's just like how you ground.
Sure.
And so Bauble, I think, really has come into its own with Lurrus, but now Dragon's the best one drop in the format, but potentially the best one drop in the format, and Dragon's Rage Channeler also getting a great payoff off of Bauble is just making it go even farther and stretching it into decks where you don't even have Lurrus anymore because you're playing and it isn't now and things like that.
Yeah. We talked about this a little bit last week, I think, but I feel like the more that I think about it, and I'm sure that you played, I'm sure you played a bunch of Dragon's Rage Channeler into Mishra's Bauble. I feel like that 1-2 punch is absurdly good when you play it. Because until you do it, you're like, well, yeah, sure, okay, I'm casting a free spell and I'm doing a surveil. But because of the way Mishra's Bauble works, where you can then make another choice on if you fetch to get rid of that top card, or if you want that card in your graveyard, it gives you just this extra look at what you're choosing to potentially draw, or choosing to put in your graveyard, along with the artifact itself. And that little synergy is so cheap and does so much to just improve the initial takeoff of your deck, because you do it typically so early on in the game.
Yeah, it's also not the initial takeoff. I mean, that helps you lots of different situations in the game. You get your Bauble back, you play it off of Lurrus, you do the same thing in the middle of the game. You get a look at a couple of cards and get to sculpt the top of your deck and then decide what you want to draw. That's great, even in the mid game. I think this is all one thing of saying, which is just kind of like, Dragon's Rage Channeler is amazing. It's not amazing because it becomes a 3/3 flyer for one. It's amazing because Surveil as a prowess ability is kind of crazy, really crazy. Because you can put a payoff into your graveyard and then have that card be available for you to bring back with Lurrus or something like that. You can double check, like, get your mana, try to get your mana right, and things like that. You can try to keep from being mana flooded by getting rid of that. It does so much stuff for such a small cost.
Yeah, especially because spells are so cheap, and then just the efficiency there is so high.
The card could stay a 1/1 forever and still be really, really good.
I think you're
Honestly,
right.
I think that's true. Now, it'd be better if it was a 1/2 so it didn't die to Lava Dart. The front half of a Lava Dart, but hypothetically speaking, it would still be a really good payoff for spells. It might be the best prowess payoff that there is in the format.
Yeah, and I think this is where I can just admit that, the take I wanted to have on Dragon's Rage Channeler being the most overrated card in the set, and probably being a little bit of a disappointment. One was to have good podcast content, but two was like a little bit of a truth, where I was like, well, it doesn't seem quite as good as people think. But I think that what you said, Dave, is true, which is it's not necessarily great because it's a 3/3 flyer. It doesn't quickly become a 3/3 flyer on turn 2 all the time and just start swinging in, and it's the new Delver of the format. It's because the synergy between just the cheap and hyper efficient spells and the way that you want to have good card selection. And like you said, like, do I want to land? Do I not want to land? Do I want the spell? Like, what's contextually good here? And that is the real power of the Surveil 1 there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Stan, have you played with Dragon's Rage too much?
I did once with one of those Is It Delverless Delver decks that Jesse forwarded with a couple weeks ago. And it was cool. Just this style of deck kind of bores me right now as a player, where I'd rather be doing something a little bit slower. I'm so rarely drawn to aggro, low to the ground aggro decks anymore.
Yeah.
That
It's interesting. It really is very in between those two things. Like, you can deal with a lot of the threats and then close the game. So it's not like you have to get on the board and win. You just have good interaction to go either way. And so I think that we should talk about one of the next Modern Horizons 2 cards, because one of the things I was going to say was the Modern Horizons 2 cards in this deck are all crazy good.
yeah.
They're all good. They're all good. And like, I have different things to say about each of them. We just spent a bunch of time talking about Dragon's Rage Channeler. Everett tweeted out after he went on his run that he thought Dragon's Rage Channeler was the best card in Modern Horizons 2. Maybe it's true. We'll see next week what people think. But
The only creatures in this deck you played that aren't from MH2 are Croxa and Lurrus.
Yep.
Everything else is a new card.
Yep. Exactly.
Makes you think.
Surprise.
Yeah, the Titan that we still have left from, what's that? Theros Beyond Death. The Elder Giant, rather.
Yeah. Guess what? Escape is still good.
Weird.
Is Escape good with Unholy Heat? Do you ever feel like those are at odds with one another?
Definitely. You have to be a little careful about that.
Yeah.
you definitely want to favor. I think you want to favor towards keeping Delirium going over getting your Kroxa back. But that is one way to turn the corner in a game that's kind of aggro. And one card that really helps you do that quickly, actually, is Ragavan.
Ha
Believe it or not.
Ooh,
Yeah. So between Dragon's Rage Channeler and Ragavan, of course, you get to fill up your graveyard. But the thing about Ragavan is, I think that in this particular deck, it's like the worst one drop in some ways, but the card is crazy good.
Yeah. It's so insane.
Good. Yeah. Because it can lead to low powered draws, which is kind of a drag sometimes. Like I had a couple times where you draw multiple Ragavans and you're like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that it ramps you and also randomly draws cards occasionally is just totally wild. And it lets you do things occasionally, like where you stick a turn 1 Ragavan, you can go really hard into your turn 4 play, or sorry, turn 3 play, where you can use 4 mana on turn 3. And what you get to do with 4 mana on turn 3 in this deck is sometimes you can escape a Kroxa on turn 3 after casting it on turn 2. Mm-hmm. And that is like, whoa.
Yeah.
And then also sometimes you can cast a kicked Turok with the right mana fixing because of Ragavan on turn 3 as well. And that is super powerful because you suddenly take 2 of your opponent's cards and also you have a 4/3 to attack with.
Yeah, Dave, I don't know if you listened to last week's episode, but one of the things that we talked about was how I was getting the idea that Dragon's Rage Channeler was sort of better in the proactive decks because you sort of were peeling through your deck and casting spells on your turn and kind of making those selections. And then Ragavan got you that mana advantage that allowed you to be more aggressive with casting stuff on your turn while keeping up reactivity. And this deck seems like you said it's sort of aggressive and mid-rangey, and maybe is it splitting the difference, do you think, in a successful way where it's like getting the best parts both of Dragon's Rage and of Ragavan, where it's like, hey, I would love an extra Lotus Petal. I would love the ability to cast the cheap spell from my opponent's hand if I'm able to get some advantage out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it helps because you're sort of like mana hungry in this deck. It's hard to get black for Turok, for example. I think the thing about this deck is that the interaction is proactive, right? Because you're casting Thoughtseize and Inquisition of Kozilek.
Yeah, so it's on your turn.
You're not waiting to counterspell stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the style that makes this deck work is that you get to cast your spells and use your mana and do all that kind of stuff, and hopefully you take away what people are really looking for.
I'm surprised to hear you say that you have a hard time with mana just because there's only 2 mountains here. Everything else produces black.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just because there aren't that many fetchable lands in this deck. So I think
you got 2 Blood Crypt, 3 Swamp, 2 Mountain.
Right. And so you're trying to like balance yourself out and you're like, do I go get 2 swamps? Like what am I doing here? Like, and then sometimes you draw something like, I mean, Graven Karen, which is like, I never thought that card would see play, but it is helpful in this deck to be able to like filter between the lands that you need and stuff like that. And then, this deck even runs like Castle Lochthwain, at least the build that I was doing. And I used it sometimes to draw extra cards. Like, it was helpful in those flooding situations. So Ragavan, living up to the hype for me, definitely was an all-star, but wasn't like the MVP in this deck. But it's a really good card.
One thing I find playing with Ragavan is I so seldom want to cast my opponent's spells. Did you find that as well?
It's like 1 out of 3 times.
Yeah.
I feel like.
It's the minority.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about that.
Maybe 1 out of 4. Even.
Sure,
usually you need to hit with Ragavan a couple of times to have a couple of Lotus Petals so that when you draw an off-color card, you can cast it. And then you're like, sure, I'll cast your Shardless Agent. Like, fine, whatever. Let's see what I cascade into in my deck. It'll be good. So that's definitely a consideration. But I think that the fixing is more than worth it here for me. And, I know it only attacks like a Savannah Lion, so it gets road stopped by a lot of things, but it's a good card.
Nimble.
Turok. No.
Not a fan?
Please talk about Dauthi.
No, the next card I really, really want to talk about is the card that I had wrong, that I thought was overhyped in this set, and that is Dauthi Voidwalker.
Oh, yes. Yes, he admitted.
You admit it, I admit it. I just felt like after that first weekend, I wasn't really seeing Dauthi anywhere, but then I played it in Shadow, and it was just in my sideboard, and I was bringing it in like every match, and was like, why aren't these cards seem good enough to be main deck? And then I saw this deck that Everett had put together, and I was like, hey, look, a full package of Dauthi Voidwalker main. The card is just so many different pieces are applicable to so many different games. It's amazing. Of course, the Graveyard Hate randomly hoses enough things here and there almost just to be worth having in game one anyway. There's no downside to playing it. It's just two mana for an unblockable 3/2. That's amazing. I won so many games this weekend by just attacking with one or two Douthie Voidwalkers when they couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, if you actually get to have it online long enough to tap it to steal a card, that's incredible.
Give us a list of cool stuff you cast, Dave.
Well, I mean, I would say you haven't lived until you've sacked a Douthie Voidwalker to cast an opponent's Lurrus to then recast your Douthie. It's not a bad sequence, right?
I would cast those spells.
Yeah. And then another time, I got to do the same thing, but so let me be clear. I didn't actually get to do that one, but the one that I did that was awesome was I had Douthie Voidwalker out. I cast Lurrus. I sacked my Douthie Voidwalker to cast my opponent's Stormwing entity, got to scry 2, and then got to replay my Douthie Voidwalker. So I went from a board of just Douthie Voidwalker to a board that was Douthie Voidwalker, Lurrus, and a Stormwing, and had just scryed 2. That was pretty great.
I like it. So no Emeralds.
No, nothing that amazing, but like even just stealing a lightning bolt is amazing here and there. And you get to cast them without you get to cast them without paying any mana cost. So it's even more crazy when you're kind of like, I'll play this on turn 2, and then if I get something great, like maybe I'll drop a 3-drop and then cast whatever card I get off.
Well, the mana cost of all of them is 2. It's the cost of Dauthi.
Yeah, but sometimes you get a couple attacks in, and then it's even better than that.
Right.
So
how did the unblockability feel? That's kind of like people have sort of been hinting as like, yeah, don't forget, it's just it's a unblockable 3/2.
Yeah, don't forget it's an unblockable 3/2. Also, please don't forget that it cannot block. So sometimes it's hard in that situation. Sometimes you do need the card to like stabilize, and if you draw a Voidwalker, then that kind of is not great. But it's worth it. You're winning. It's worth it. Okay, now let's talk about Turok.
I'm so curious about this card.
So I think that Turok is the card that's the most on the bubble. And I've seen a lot of people try different things in this slot. Like towards the end of the weekend, it seemed like people were playing Dark Confidant over Turok because the mana cost of everything in this deck is so low that you're not at a great risk to like hurt yourself. So it was almost pushing the whole deck to be a little more Jund-like in that sense. But I found Turok to be really powerful, really swingy, but expensive. It's nice to have a card that comes down as a 4/3, a card that you can cast with the kicker from Lurrus, so you can get a 4/3 down and get a couple of extra cards later. The Pro White's occasionally good. I definitely don't think you want 3 like I had in the build that I was playing, like Everett's earlier build. I think that everybody shaving it down to 2 makes a bunch of sense. And it might be that, hey, it's better to get some card draw in instead. But I had some incredible moments where I got to like, someone thought they had me. We had a traded down, and then I cast Turok, and I take their like Urza's Saga and Bribery. So I would get their last couple of cards, and then they're just done because they don't have any way to generate card advantage fast enough to catch up. And then occasionally, if they kill my Turok, then I just recast it with Lurrus anyway, and we're just off to the races again. And the other thing about Turok is that it keeps getting bigger. So if you play a Turok, have them discard 2, and then they hold on a card, and then you cast an Inquisition Coast, like it gets another counter. And then you can just keep going that way. So I had a couple of games where I was like attacking with a 6/5 Turok as well, and that was really helpful.
Yeah, it's a bit of a combo with Kroxa and your other discard spells.
Yeah, but this is the way that I close out so many games with this, though, is with Kroxa. As honest, what happened a lot was I would be like, okay, I got your cards down to nothing. I Kroxa you one time, I'm hitting you with a Douthie Voidwalker, and then I Kroxa you, and you take 3 life, and then I attack with it one time, and you die to the trigger. I don't even have to hit you with the 6/6. So I think Turok is good, but I'm not sure it's the right card for that slot. I think there's a lot of other options you can play there.
It's a flex slot.
Yeah. Unholy Heat, you guys talked about it.
It's hot and godless.
It might have been the real MVP of the deck, just because of how many different things you could kill with it for 1 mana. It just catches you up so fast. It helps you get rid of a threat that is like previously out of reach for decks like this, or that you would have to run like Terminate for. I did see people running Terminate in this deck towards the end of the weekend as well. And, I think that makes sense to have a couple of outs to like Tarmogoyf, because Tarmogoyf is pretty good against this deck. Because if you get your Tarmogoyf up to a 6/7, you literally can't kill it because you don't have any Fatal Push in this.
I mean, 6/7 is pretty hard.
It's not that hard if I'm filling my graveyard and you're filling your graveyard, though. You know what I mean? So I think it's kind of in the middle somewhere. I did a final shout out to Kroxa already. The card was probably one of the other like MVPs of the deck. whether I was just getting a couple triggers or swinging in with it. It was awesome. So this deck is really good. It seems like everybody agrees that this deck is really good. The results from this weekend show that it's really good.
Yeah, like, do you think, is this deck able to prey on the Izzet decks, for example? I feel like it would be able to pretty much pick them apart.
Yeah, I think it does. Definitely.
So is that like maybe why we saw like a downswing in the performance of Izzet? I
think it's a big part of it, for sure. Again, I think it's because, but I also think it's, like we said earlier, it's because of more the pervasiveness of Unholy Heat. So I think that even against other decks that are running Unholy Heat, of which I'm not sure how many there are other than Izzet and Red-Black, there might not be that many that are actually running it.
It's basically most red Lurrus decks because you need the baubles and maybe a Tarfire.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's causing a big problem with it as well. So when I picked this up, this deck is so good that I even trophied with this deck.
Nice.
My man with a trophy.
And you bought the trophy at a store, right?
I did. I put my own name on it. I got myself a trophy, and it's up on the wall over here in my basement next to my cards from when I Grand Prix Day-2'd.
That's right.
Over there.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Do you think this deck benefited at all from the fact that it was really new? I mean, like, the deck is a week old, if that, and people just weren't necessarily prepared to attack its unique blend of aggro, mid-range disruption in the low to the ground Lurrus package.
How are they going to attack this deck, though? This is like this. It's sort of like reminiscent of like the older Shadow style decks, where it's like, hey, I'm going to pick apart your hand and take away anything that matters, and take away what's going to stop you from stopping me.
Well, I mean, no one's playing Fatal Push right now, and I feel like Fatal Push eats this alive.
Yeah, I mean, mostly I think Graveyard is pretty good against this deck.
Yeah.
And so I think that's probably, like, Graveyard Hate is pretty good against it. You're
maybe even an Esper deck.
Going slightly
the Esper
bigger.
Control decks, because they have like a nice blend of black removal with some reactive spells.
Yeah, I think there are plenty of ways to attack a deck like this. I guess is what I would definitely say is, like, there's a lot of ability for the metagame to move around this deck, and that's just how it is with mid-rangey decks like this. Is they can often be the best deck, but they're not often the best deck for long, or they don't stay the same build for long. Like, if you want to keep a deck like this good, you have to really like craft those flex spots so they're good in individual moments in the metagame.
So believe minus?
Yeah, if we're gonna do sleeve believe heave, I think this is a full believe right now. Like I said, it carried me to a trophy, and honestly, I don't even think I played that well. It was just like I had everything I needed every time I needed it.
I love
so you're a sleever. You're not just a believer.
Yeah, I'm a sleever.
Yeah, you're gonna get these pieces. You still have that one Croxa that I just left here, and you eventually just paid me for.
Yep.
Yeah.
That you left here a year and a half ago or whatever. Last thing I would say about this deck, it's like 1,100 tickets on Moto, so
it's hard to rent.
Good luck,
Dave. I'll talk about a much cheaper deck on Magic Online. It's a mere 330 Magic the Gathering Online tickets, and it is another deck that features Modern Horizons 2 cards, and that is the newer builds of Hammer, or Hammertime, or Mono White Hammer, or whatever we want to call it. And it's called that because, of course, Colossus, Hammer. And we talked about this deck in a full-blown dive down episode a number of months ago when it was first sort of coming onto the scene and doing quite well and being at pretty much tier 1, I'd say, in the modern metagame. And I think that it's one of the sleeper decks, I'd say, of the emerging modern metagame because it's able to use a few new pieces and primarily the piece of Urza's Saga to get a lot of advantage that I didn't have before. And so I played this deck in some practice games. I did a full league with it. And there were some strengths and weaknesses of the deck and a few complex play patterns that caused me to misplay that I want to talk about because I think the deck is really fascinating right now. I think it's really good right now. And I think that it uses one new tool in Esper Sentinel just fine. And then Urza Saga, I think, brings a new aspect to this deck that I didn't have before that allows it to play a different angle. And as we have seen in a number of different decks throughout Modern's history and in recent history, is being able to play a few different kind of attacks and having a few different ways of approaching a game is really advantageous, where you're not just a linear aggro combo deck. You can grind out an opponent. You can attack what they're trying to do. And I think that this deck does something new with Urza Saga that I want to go over. So let's I guess if you're not familiar with this deck, what it really is doing is it plays a pile of cheap artifacts and things like Memnite and Ornithopter and things like Springleaf Drum to accelerate your mana. And then a number of cards, cheap cards, that can provide protection and disruption, things like Giver of Runes, and the new card Esper Sentinel, which also is an artifact, which comes into play when we talk about the card Pure Steel Paladin. And I guess I'm kind of missing the most important thing, Colossus Hammer, which is a 1-mana artifact that gives an equipped creature +10/+10. It loses flying, however, which is important. It's a very heavy hammer. The problem here, though, is that the equip cost is 8. So as we talked about in the Dive Down episode, the way this deck works is by getting around that equip cost through primarily 2 cards, almost exclusively 2 cards, actually, which are Pure Steel Paladin, who I just mentioned a minute ago. It's a white 2/2, and when an equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. Oh, that's cool. Oh, but also Metalcraft. If you have 3 or more artifacts, the equip cost of any equipment you control is 0. So that lets you play your Colossus Hammer and then equip it to anything for 0 mana, which is great, nice and cheap. And then we also have Sigarda's Aid, which is an enchantment, single white mana. You can cast auras and enchantments as though they had flash. Oh, that's cool. But whenever an equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you can attach it to target creature you control. So that's the other way we have to cheat this 8 mana equip cost of Colossus Hammer. So Pure Steel Paladin needs to have 3 artifacts. Therefore, you want to have a number of cheap ones on the battlefield doing stuff for you. And of course, we have Stoneforge Mystic. You need ways to get hammers into your hand. So you have things like Stoneforge Mystic, which tutors it out of your library.
Did this deck always have Stoneforge in it?
It always did.
I'm trying to remember.
Because that was just one of the ways to get a hammer. So you play your 2-mana creature, you tutor up the hammer, and because you don't really care about Stoneforge really living past that, because you're not casting out an expensive Batterskull, you're not putting an expensive Batterskull onto the battlefield. You're not putting an expensive Calder Complete onto the battlefield. Once you cast Stoneforge, she has done her job for you, and you have that hammer in your hand, and because the casting cost is so cheap, it's not a big deal, as long as your cheater elements are surviving. So let's talk about... So the game plan is essentially get hammer, cheat hammer, preferably onto something like a flyer, like Ornithopter. You can maybe if you can flash it in on Sigarda's Aid after they've declared their attacks and then haven't been blocked, then you get some fast damage in. Maybe you have 2 hammers and a single attacker. Like on turn 1, you go... Like the fastest kills are things like Ornithopter or Memnite, turn 1, along with a Sigarda's Aid on turn 1. Turn 2... play a second land, and then you just flash in 2 Colossus Hammers onto that 0 mana attacker, and you do 20 damage, or 21 damage, and the game is over. And that doesn't happen super infrequently, but you can very easily get turn 3 kills, turn 4 kills. There's ways of getting an Inkmoth Nexus in on turn 3 pretty reliably if you have Sigarda's Aid and things like that. So there's a lot of ways to quickly kill with this deck, and that was kind of its MO in the past, was quick combo creature plus cheating the equip cost of Colossus Hammer and winning. What this deck does now, with the addition of Urza Saga, is give you, an additional way to tutor up the Colossus Hammer, because remember, after the 3rd phase of the saga triggers, what are those phases? What are they? They're chapters, yes, because they are stories or sagas. So the 3rd chapter goes off, and then it says search your library for an artifact card with mana cost 1 or 0, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Colossus Hammer costs 1. So that's yet another way for you to tutor up a Colossus Hammer to combine with one of your cheater effects. So in this deck, it seems to... Some people are shaving completely the Steel Shaper's Gift, which is a 1 white mana sorcery that basically says go get an artifact or an equipment card out of your library, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And so with Urza Saga, we're both getting the land that does this for you, but importantly gives you the side game or the alternate game plan I mentioned earlier, and we've been talking about on this podcast for the past few weeks, of the construct mini game, which is how many constructs can I make that combine with my pile of cheap artifacts and each other to then give me beaters that cost me nothing. And so if your opponent is a removal heavy deck and they're taking care of your Memnites and your Ornithopters and your Giver of Runes and all that and your Pure Steel Paladins, that kind of stuff, then you're also able to say, well, I'm going to pop out some Urza Sagas by just kind of doing nothing and sitting back and using my mana.
Speaking of beaters that cost nothing,
Yes.
since when does Memnite cost $5?
Oh, yeah. That's a thing. It just doesn't have a lot of reprints.
Yeah.
And this deck is staying popular, and the affinity decks are coming back. And so, 0 mana 1/1s aren't free, Stan.
Apparently not.
And so, a little bit more about Urza Saga. What it does is, so it gives you that just alternate game plan of saying, hey, I don't need to win through a combo. I can win by just playing these constructs that easily get up to 5/5. 6/6 even in this deck, because you just have a lot of Springleaf Drums or Colossus Hammers that you're not equipping on anything, or Shadow Spears that you tutored up, or your Esper Sentinels, which are artifacts and add to the artifact pile, or even making Inkmoth Nexus into a creature just to add to the power and toughness of your constructs. Tricky, yeah. But what's also important too is that tutor ability can get all sorts of stuff. So it can get a Springleaf Drum to keep your mana online. Some people are playing interesting things like a main deck Pithing Needle, which does some advantageous things where, like, remember when I mentioned before, you don't really care if your Stoneforge Mystic can use her ability? Against competing Stoneforge Mystic decks, it's a perfectly great name on Pithing Needle to say Stoneforge Mystic. The Pithing Needle main is like, you can look at it and be like, what do I really care about naming? But there's a lot of stuff, because Urza Saga, it kind of does that same thing like Meddling Mage, often Aether Vial does, where it's like, I'm coming into play and I'm naming something instantly and you can't respond to it. It's like you can catch people out where there's like, maybe they don't crack a fetch land. Do you know what I mean? And like, you're just like, oh, like I can name that fetch with Pithing Needle because like you can't respond to it coming into play. That's some edge case type stuff, but there's some power there. I think it's good enough to keep running. You can do stuff like run an expedition map. I didn't run that. It lets you just kind of cycle through Urza Saga, where you're like, Urza Saga pops, get an expedition map, go get another Urza Saga to keep making constructs for the kind of your long grinding game, which does happen a surprisingly frequent amount with this deck, which is just like, I need to win the long game. And that's what this deck does really well with things like Lurrus, with things like Urza Saga, and just the ability to top deck all sorts of different cards that allow you to then cheat the equip cost. Or you get a few Giver of Runes down and you give something protection to get through a wall of blockers where they have a few colors and all you need to do is get that second Giver of Runes down or something like that. So the deck plays really similarly to how it did before, but you have another angle of grind, you have another angle of attack, you have another tutor, which is really advantageous because that lets you then focus on your opening hands having the cheat, which is kind of really key, because you can say to yourself, well, I have a Sigarda's Aid and I have a creature, and I don't necessarily have to have that hammer in hand if I'm mulling to 6 or something like that, because you can say I have 12 different ways to find a hammer, where it's like, I've got Stoneforge, I've got Colossus Hammer, I've got Urza Saga, and I have the ability to grind my way into the hammer and then cheat it into play or something like that.
I want to talk about Esper Sentinel.
Yeah, I was going there next, but yeah, what's your question?
Do you love it?
No.
Oh.
No,
I thought it was fine. I honestly thought it was pretty fine. Like
good looking?
That art.
I mean,
swords.
Maybe it might be the thing where it's like, you know how sometimes, like, you guys probably don't play a lot of Dredge on Magic Online, but dredging on Magic Online doesn't feel like dredging in paper, because like it just goes into a big bucket on your graveyard button, and you're just like, oh, well, I got like 13 cards there. But when you do that in paper, you appreciate it a lot more. And I feel like drawing cards is sometimes the same way in Magic Online for me, where like the card just sort of appears in my tray. I didn't have the physical act of drawing the card and placing it into my hand and being like, oh yeah, I drew that card. That felt really good. And so I think I did draw a certain number of cards off Sentinel. At the same time, it is also a lightning rod at times, where it's like, okay, well, the opponent feels they have to get rid of it. Or sometimes they pay the tax, and that's good too, because the tax is their mana. And it is an artifact, and it does all that kind of stuff, and it's a perfectly fine addition to this deck, but it didn't feel like it busted it open in the same way that Urza Saga kind of just gave me a different angle of winning a game. Like, I'm not winning the game because I was for Sentinel, it's just adding value to the deck, which is fine.
How often did you search up a Meta Knight or an Ornithopter with?
Probably less than I should have. Honestly, like I think there are a lot of mistakes you can make in this deck because you have a lot of choices, or you have a certain number of choices. And so, like, when do I get that Shadow Spear? Like, I took out a Shadow Spear in a matchup, and it was just like, whenever you take out a Shadow Spear, you want a Shadow Spear. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's like
never take out one-ups. That's something I've learned.
It's always just like, oh, I don't need this because my opponent's playing a combo deck, and then like they have got 3 creatures on the other side of the battlefield because they're sort of a weird creature-y combo deck, or it's like a Cascade combo where they have Shardless Agents resolved or something like that. And it's just like, well, I really wish I had that Shadow Spear to trample over them, but now I've got to attack 3 times, giving them times to find their combo pieces. So I think I talked enough about this deck that we've already talked about.
I actually have a couple more questions.
Okay, please.
Sanctifier Envec.
It's great. You need to be playing. I think I had 4 pro red creatures. Sanctifier on Vec, just having pro black and pro red is just amazing. Like it single-handedly won me games against like mono red prowess, and even does a ton of work against Izzet prowess
And Rakdos.
And Shadow. And so like I think I can see Sanctifier on Vec being one of those cards where you're always going to play it because it's like your core Firewalker, or it's like your Auriok champion type effect, but sort of has a little bit of extra value because I don't care about gaining life as much. Like, I'm not the Heliod combo deck that wants to have the life gain trigger. It's just sort of a high value card that pulls its weight. And then Burrington Forest Changer is just a 1 mana pro red card that can do a lot of work just buying you time. And you equip a Colossus Hammer to it and swing through a bunch of red creatures that are on the other side of the battlefield, or combine it with Giver of Runes and give it pro whatever else it needs and get through,
or just to cast it over and over again with Lurrus.
Yeah, right. I mean that's the kind of loop that like long game can do, like high value. Like that's the kind of stuff that I never got really the chance to, but that's the kind of thing that I didn't even think about, because like those are like the small edges that you can generate with a card like Lurrus that you can't generate with a lot of other cards do not give you the power that Lurrus gives you. In fact, I think no other card gives you the power that Lurrus gives you at its cost, especially. Seal of Cleansing is like fine. It feels expensive. Mm-hmm. Seal of Cleansing it feels like it should be like 1.5 mana instead of 2, which is like fine. But Prismatic Ending, I love Prismatic Ending. It's like the first time I really got to sort of play with that card, and plays great.
Wait. Can we go back?
Yeah.
You would like Disenchant to cost 1.5 mana instead of 2 mana?
Yeah, 1.5. You think that's too cheap?
I mean, I just think it's a lot to ask out of a card that was in alpha.
Yeah, I know. Well, Seal of Cleansing is, you're right. It's basically Disenchant, right?
It's Disenchant, and you get to cast it over and over again with Lurrus.
So, yeah, that's a good point, too. Okay, so much stuff you can do with Lurrus in this deck. So one of the mistakes I did make a lot, and this is just Shane being out of practice, playing Modern instead of Historic, is like, even though I popped up the little companion window and like had it in my little hand area, there were multiple games where I was like, oh, forgot to put Lurrus in my hand.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that lost me games.
Yeah.
Like just straight up lost, because you're 1 turn behind, and that's all you need in Modern to just blow it.
Well, and you're like, oh, I don't have anything I can do on turn 5. Pass.
You're like,
I need to draw something. You're like, oh, I did have something important I could have done on turn
something
5.
extremely important. Get one of the best creatures in the format into my hand.
I found that one of the ways I've learned to avoid that over the last year now, maybe it's been less than a year, is just planning my sequencing around eventually casting Lurrus.
Just thinking about it all the time.
Yeah, like it's just I try to play it like I'm running a Lurrus deck first and foremost.
It's been more than a year since Lurrus has been around, by the way.
Oh, man.
It's been more than a year.
Yeah, Lurrus was in the spring set last year. So what is that, April, March?
Oh yeah, it came out right after COVID.
Yeah.
Started.
How much longer will it be with us? We'll find out.
Not long.
I don't know.
I don't think very long, but we'll see.
So I went 2-3. I went 2-0 into 2-3, like the feel bad league.
You're a pro too. Good job.
Yeah, I know. But I really could have been 4-1. I mean, just like a couple stupid games that I punted just really badly. And I was like, well, if I had played that one turn differently. But this is not about Shane's bad beat stories. It's more about, I think the deck is really good. And I think the real issue with this deck is it's facing a lot of, like, I guess you could call it splash hate. I mean, even though you are playing Urza's Saga, you don't feel like, I'm not a food deck. I shouldn't be hurt by this. But like, yeah, you're an artifact deck with Urza's Saga. So all of the Force of Vigors, all of the enchantment / artifact hate out there is hating you too. And so you're not going to love it. You're not going to love Shatterstorms. You're not going to love all that kind of stuff. But when you stick in Urza Saga and you can grind people out with some constructs, or you top deck that Pure Steel Paladin, lets you equip that Colossus Hammer that's been on the battlefield and win, it's going to feel good. And the deck still feels, it's a lot of fun. I now own this deck in paper and I'm hyped to be able to play it. I bought Stoneforge Mystics again, Dave.
No.
But anyway,
Yeah, for how much?
How much did you pay?
Oh no, I got Russian ones from an online friend who's selling out, and I got them for fairly reasonably, less than English. So anyway, that's my story about Stoneforge Mystics.
He did not give us a number. How much did you sell your Stoneforge Mystics for?
I think I basically ended up equal, about selling them a year ago and buying them back a year later.
When you buy Russian cards, do you pay in rubles or Bitcoin?
Is ruble the currency of Russia?
It is, yes.
In Russia, rubles pay you.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a good deck. Enjoy. If you like this style of deck, play it. Stan, I want to hear about what you did this week.
Wow, that was a whole lot of content about a deck we've done a whole deck dive on. Thank you, Shane.
Weird coming from me, right?
So, I wanted to do something a little different for myself, really. And astute listeners might recognize that I've been trying to use these episodes to play some of the decks that I was skeptical about and maybe even poo-pooed a little bit during spoiler season. So for today's episode, I decided to try out this Enchantress, this green-white Enchantress deck that has been popping up in league results and tournaments.
I honestly forgot. I did not look at your point in the notes. I did not realize you played Enchantress.
Oh, I played Enchantress.
I'm amped.
I was messaging you guys about it the other day.
I don't pay attention to your messages.
That explains why I haven't gotten paid back for all the money I've given you over the years. I need that $14,000 back, by the way.
Dan is like, I have the receipts. Here's
I bought a Civic CX. It's a hatchback.
Yeah. So I like I said, I played this deck because not only I wanted to test my own boundaries and try something different that we really haven't been talking about, and kind of challenge some of my preconceived notions about this deck when the set was being spoiled. But also, I was under the impression that I probably have never really played a deck quite like this. This is a pretty new strategy to Modern. Like, there were white-based prison decks in the past that used things like Ghostly Prison to lock out opponents. And this is really leaning into mostly Modern Horizons cards.
It's a lot.
Yeah, Sanctum Weaver, Sithis, Harvest Hand, Sterling Grove, Solitary Confinement. All of these are really important cards that made this deck possible because they were printed or reprinted in MH2. So I went into this thinking I was going to try something different and fresh, broaden my horizons, and it just turned out I was playing a prison deck. And it feels like, in that regard, figuring out what you're supposed to do with this deck is fairly easy because it's kind of just a race to Solitary Confinement to make sure you don't lose, because that's the best way you have to not lose.
I honestly didn't realize that this deck played Solitary Confinement because all the times I played against it, I've never seen that resolved. Is that always in these decks?
I think, not only do I think it's in all of these consistently successful decks, like the 4th place deck from the Insights 5K, that's a Solitary Confinement deck too. Actually, not only do I think is it consistently in these decks, I think it is critical to your plan, and you're trying to just get out and protect your Solitary Confinement as quickly as possible. You can almost call this green-white confinement.
So explain what this card does for you, and then how you win once you have it. Because I feel like that is that's the thing that's hard for, I think, most people, perhaps me.
Yes.
That's what's confusing about this deck.
Sure. So I'll read it. Solitary Confinement, 2 and a white enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, sack Solitary Confinement unless you discard a card. Skip your draw step. You have Shroud. Also, prevent all damage that would be dealt to you. So your opponents can attack you. It just does no damage. They can't target you with anything. And then...
So how are you drawing cards?
What you're trying to do is really offset the potential card disadvantage. And what this deck does in order to offset that disadvantage is it runs 4 copies of Enchantress's Presence, which is 2 and a green enchantment when you cast an enchantment, draw a card, along with 4 copies of Sithis Harvest Hand, which is a 2-drop green white 1/2 from MH2. Whenever you cast an enchantment, you gain a life and draw a card.
And it also runs Setessan Champion, which also draws a card.
So some of these decks have Setessan Champion. It's not a staple. So first thing you want to do is try to get out these card drawing enchantments. They're part of your engine, essentially. And you also, another very important card to your plan is Sterling Grove. I almost feel like this is kind of like a 3-card combo where what you are trying to do is get out 2 Sterling Groves, which are green, white enchantment, other enchantments you control.
The old Drug Skull Captain combo.
Yeah,
exactly.
Everybody has Shroud now.
Yeah, so you get 2 Sterling Groves and a solitary confinement, and your cards can't be targeted, and you can't be targeted with anything because everything has Shroud. And then ideally you've got at least one, but preferably multiple Enchantresses presence or a presence and a Sithis Harvest Hand, and then you're just drawing cards and cards and cards. Solitary confinement is not what wins you games. It's essentially what keeps you from losing games, or it wins you a game because most savvy opponents just scoop to that. Because I think the writing is on the wall at that point. But if you really need to win the game, the most common win condition is Destiny Spinner, which is from Theros Beyond Death, 1 and a green 2/3. It gives creatures and enchantments you control uncounterability, but it also has 3 and a green, target land you control becomes an XX elemental with trample and haste, trample being really important there, where X is the number of enchantments you control. So you're playing all these enchantments to either deal with your opponent's creatures, protect yourself from losing the game, protect all of your other permanents, and then you make a giant forest that swings for 10. That's it. Not a very disruptive deck. You've got 4 copies of Anthenice. Sometimes you'll have a Banishing Light. Sometimes, not always, you'll have a Blood Moon. But I often felt when I was playing this deck that I was trying to protect myself more so than trying to disrupt what my opponents are doing. But it's really consistent. Because it has 8 of these Enchantress Presence effects, but also it has Sanctum Weaver, which is the 1 and a green dork where you add X equal to the number of enchantments you control. And Sanctum Weaver allows you to just basically cast your whole hand. Once you get your engine going, you're just generating so much value. So that's another point where your opponents just eventually scoop to you.
Yeah, this deck has always felt like an exponential growth deck when I play against it, where it's just like piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, 99 pieces.
Yes.
It's just like the deck just sort of like turns the corner in a very hard way that a lot of other decks can't do the same way.
Yeah. One of the other win conditions that this deck sometimes has is Sigil of the Empty Throne, which is a 5-mana enchantment from, I think, Magic Origins. Maybe it's been printed a few times. But what's neat about that card with Sanctum Weaver is that you can sometimes cast it as early as turn 3 or 4. Just because maybe on turn 1 you're playing a Utopia Sprawl, and then on turn 2 you did an Anthenice or an Abundant Growth. And then if you get a Sanctum Weaver out early, that's tapping for 3 or 4 mana incredibly quickly, and then you've just won the mana advantage game at that point. One of the things that I think this deck was kind of a problem that I had to figure out how to overcome was the fact that it doesn't really have a lot of tutors. Your only tutor is your Sterling Grove, which you need to sacrifice in order to get another card. And I only found myself doing that if, say, my opponent cast a Vindicate on my Sterling Grove because I didn't have a way to cast 2 to protect each other. And then you just Sterling Grove for a Sterling Grove. Or if you're in a position where you have 3 of them, you can Sterling Grove for a win condition.
Yeah. Sounds right to me.
I did not realize this sort of had built-in removal protection, where it's just like, it doesn't say an enchantment card that's not Sterling Grove.
Right.
You can just be like, I've got 1 open mana. I'm going to get another Sterling Grove, my friend.
Exactly. One thing that I think is really cool about this deck, and I don't think it's me being some big brain Enchantress player, I actually felt that this deck was really easy to pilot. Because it kind of does the same thing over and over. Either it's drawing you a ton of cards off of your presence effects, or you're casting, like Anthenice to delay the game. And then once you start to see that like you have Sterling Grove to protect all of your stuff, it's at that point the game plan sort of emerges before you. So I was really impressed by how easy it was to pick up. And I did 0 research into this deck before I actually played it. I just rented it and started playing it.
Rented League.
And
Done.
Yeah, and then it just kind of unfolded onto me.
How'd it go?
I didn't play a league with it. I didn't play a full league with it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get to know it, and I really loved it. One thing that I kept thinking about, though, was one of Spike's criticisms of all these enchantment cards when we did our set review with him was that this deck is never beating Tron.
That's right.
And I think that's true. And
Did you face Tron or just like realize that you just wouldn't be able to beat it?
Well, I just think you can't really beat Karn the Great Creator ticking up and resetting the game.
Or you can't beat O-Stone.
O-Stone, yeah, that would be good too. But then I realized that no one's playing Tron right now, so I don't think that's really a problem. And what's great about this is actually it's good against some of these low to the ground aggro decks because you can slow them down long enough that unless they really tear your hand apart, no one can answer solitary confinement.
Interesting.
Yeah, like what's weird about this deck, and I think Jesse in our Slack mentioned this, is that there's just a few cards that exist in the game that, like, what 1 and a white or 2 and a white destroy all enchantments. I'm forgetting the name of it. And then there's like a green one that just destroys all enchantments. And there's cheap and effective. And as soon as this deck is prevalent enough to have people playing this in any amount in their sideboard, the deck is extremely at risk just being hated out.
I guess, but you would need a lot of enchantment removal to really disrupt what this deck is doing because it's able to draw so many cards and do its thing so consistently. And I think in some cases, this deck is made better by the fact that enchantments are just the hardest permanent to interact with. And the only card I was ever really, really worried about was Vindicate out of an Esper opponent.
How many of those did you see?
I mean, just the one, but it was enough that I realized, like, oh, Vindicate is kind of a problem.
Yeah, because it exiles.
Any permanent.
Yeah.
You don't have real recursion usually either in this deck. So if an opponent does manage to answer one of your enchantments, it's gone.
Yeah. Yeah. You're just moving on. But you draw so many cards.
Unless you're playing Hall of Heliod's Judgment, which likewise is not a staple for some reason.
Yeah, that's a surprise. It seems like that's a card that should be here as like a one of, just for when you go really long and need to find something. Or
yeah, I mean, being able to play a turn 1 Utopia Sprawl is really important.
Yeah. So you have so many forests, basically.
Right. Most of your lands tap for green. You have 2 planes, but otherwise most of your lands just tap for green.
So is this the deck that, because we're not seeing that suspend, return all enchantments from the graveyard to the battlefield, if it's not even in this deck's sideboard, that card's not being played?
I kind of think so, yeah.
Just not what you want to be doing. It's not how you're going to win the game.
Yeah, and you don't need it. You don't need recursion. Unless you're in an environment where you're playing against a lot of enchantment hate, your enchantments mostly stick around. I don't know. I think this deck is cool. I think it's, prison-esque, where it's probably one that certain pilots will want to master, and it'll kind of become an iconic strategy that will linger, especially because enchantments are so hard to deal with. But maybe in a control-heavy or in a Tron-heavy meta game, I can see this really struggling, but it being a pretty viable option to deal with maybe some of these super aggressive red decks in particular.
Yeah. I mean, when it's been played against me and looking at these deck lists, it looks like Bogles, but not an aggressive deck. It's just sort of like, it's like the value Bogles, where it's like, I have a lot of enchantments, I'm drawing a lot of cards, and you just can't recover from this. Mm-hmm. That's just, but like I think you said, I think it plays very similarly, where it's like I have these pieces that do similar things. There's various cards that draw me cards. There's various cards that ramp my mana. There's various things that take advantage of having other enchantments, and then I'm just going to win the game. And I think that's just kind of, some people like decks like this because they get to do the same thing. This is like a deck that I can imagine people foiling out, where it's just like, it's fairly cheap. I'm going to get these cool fancy pieces. I'm going to go to F&M and have a good old time.
You sure are.
And just really annoy some people, like a lot, when you play this.
Yeah, deck was cool. Probably not going to be a tier 1 staple. I was impressed, but not fully surprised to see it appear in the top 8 of the Insights Esports. But I think I wouldn't expect to see it consistently in top 8 challenge results, so to speak. Maybe top 32. It's going to be in leagues forever. But it's probably the best enchantment deck that I've ever seen as well. Even those old Suppression Field Ghostly Prison decks were super dinky.
Yeah, well, when you said that, though, it made me think about Bogles.
Right.
But
that's an aggro deck. That's prowess.
It's different. Yeah, it is kind of prowessy, more so. So maybe the best enchantment control deck, enchantment prison deck that you've ever seen.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Totally. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that solitary confinement does what a lot of those old prison pieces do, but in one card, where it's less about getting like a variety of prison enchantments to deal with what your opponent's doing. It's more about just getting your solitary confinement and finding a way to protect it.
What do you think about this as a budget deck?
Well,
Aside from
it's
the
$800.
well, aside from the mana base, though.
I mean, it looks like 600 to me.
So I'm looking at Goldfish right now, and it says $600.
And Goldfish is usually a little bit higher than you can find it on like TCG Low or something.
$300 of that is at least in the mana base, mostly between 4 Windswept Heath and 4 Prismatic Vistas. Actually, according to Goldfish, the most expensive card in this deck is. Did you know that Utopia Sprawl is $17 a copy right now?
Pretty good right now.
That's the most expensive card in the deck.
And that's another example of doesn't see a lot of reprints. It depends on the version. You're looking at the one I listed in the docs, but sometimes this deck is playing Greater Oromancy.
Yeah, that's
which is an $80 card too, and that's your extra copy of Sterling Grove. It's not quite as good as Sterling Grove because it doesn't fetch in response to removal, but it's nice to have that 5th copy.
Yeah, Greater Oromancy, it's a super popular EDH card, and it was $50, and now it's spiked up to $80.
Right. And sometimes these decks play Blood Moons, which I think is like $10 right now, but that can go up over time.
Yeah.
I'm surprised Blood Moon has not gone up more. I think it's just a consequence of having so many printings because people haven't. There's a lot of red decks, and Blood Moon I think is pretty good right now in the meta.
Dave, your question is interesting. What do I think of this as a budget deck? I didn't really think of this as a budget deck.
I mean, I think for Modern, it kind of might be.
Yeah.
Sad but true.
If you take out the fetches, or if you already have Windswept Heaths, but you don't have Prismatic Vistas, you might be able to put a version of this deck together pretty cheaply. Can't have Greater Oromancy. Probably can't get Utopia Sprawl. I mean, you have to get Utopia Sprawls to make this deck work. So maybe you already have those, but
I think that's a really interesting way to frame it, and I can see it being that. Like, I can see this being the type of deck that sort of you can have for a really long time because they don't print busted enchantments all that often. And right now it's a pretty elegant build right now where it has a really clearly defined plan that I think by using Solitary Confinement for such a powerful ability, it's unlikely that that's the card that ever gets outmoded. Or same with Sterling Grove, like a protection spell that you can use to fetch more enchantments thereafter is unlikely to get outmoded. So you probably have this very resilient shell that's resilient to power creep.
Yeah.
So maybe this is an enchantment, a budget deck that you can kind of have a functional version that you improve over time and can maybe count on it to actually stay pretty consistent.
Yeah.
In its design and its functionality.
Yeah.
Just beware of Tron, beware of control, but if you're worried about aggro, I actually think this is the reason why I think this did well in an Insights environment was because Insights was probably a very aggressive metagame.
Yeah. And it did well kind of for the same reason that Adnaz does well, because it happens to be a deck that is set up main deck already to deal with aggro and then win through some kind of combo-ish ending.
Right.
That's cool. All right.
We did it. We talked about decks.
In person.
Yeah.
Face to face.
That was fun. Should we do this every week?
Yeah, I'll just fly in. I mean, use that Patreon money.
Just fly you back 2 nights a week?
Yeah, just fly back to be uncomfortable in Dave's basement being like, I don't know how to be in person with anybody anymore.
Yeah, next time I come to Dave's basement, I'm wearing a fur coat, though, because
it's brisk, baby.
It's very cold.
What temperature is it here now?
We're at 65 now.
Hey, that's balmy.
We've gone up 5 degrees since we
because I
started
opened the
recording.
windows and let the heat in.
That does wrap up this week's episode. Thanks, guys, for doing this in person with us. Thank you, listeners, for bearing with our unusual audio. I'm sure it sounds fine.
I'm sure it doesn't, but we'll talk about that more later.
Different doesn't mean worse.
Correct.
If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast, you can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word. You can email thedivedown@gmail.com. You can also support the show via Patreon, joining our Patreon over at patreon.com/thedivedown. Join at any tier. Have fun in the conversation. See decks. Get into the marketplace. I've been buying cards from our patrons. Sell cards to the hosts of The Dive Down only on Patreon.
Yeah, we have our buy list prices posted up. Anytime you want to check them out, you can just come and hit it up. It's all automated.
Dive Down bots.
Dive Down bots.
On MTGO.
This episode and this show would not be possible without the support of manatraders.com. They made it possible to rent all of the cards we talked about today, and you can rent them too. Get better, support the show while playing Magic with a Mana Trader subscription. And if you use promo code TheDiveDown2021, all one word, you'll get 15% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and spend some time with your friends in a cool basement on a warm summer day. Make eye contact.
Have audio problems.
Hug someone.
That's right.